A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 7 of the Power of Zero show. This is David McKnight. I'm glad you're with us. You can learn more about me at davidmcknight.com. Today, we're going to talk about the Power of Zero documentary that we've been filming over the course of the last 8 to 10 months that released in October. And we're going to talk about how you can watch that movie, whether you're a financial advisor or you're just someone that's getting ready to experience the power of zero in retirement. I'd like to start off by talking about the motivation behind the movie. I think number one, I think that there's just some people that don't read books. Some people don't read books. And if it's the message of the Power of Zero book can be appreciated in a different medium, possibly from the comfort of your own couch, and that's certainly what we were trying to do. But the other thing is, one of the misgivings that some people have, either after sitting through one of our workshops or reading the book, is they'll say, gosh, Dave, I agree with everything you're saying, except I'm not entirely convinced that tax rates in the future are going to be dramatically higher than they are today. So what for a long time, we've been relying upon David Walker as the expert witness in terms of making the case that tax rates are going up. But what we wanted to do was really go out and interview the most compelling experts in the country that have anything meaningful to say about the debt, and put them on record and say, okay, are tax rates going up? When can we expect them to go up? What are some other issues surrounding this debate that we need to be keen in on? And then finally, what are some of the solutions that are available to people who believe that tax rates in the future are likely to be higher than they are today? I'd like to start discussing next the title and the subtitle of the movie. Of course, The Power of Zero is based on the book, The Power of Zero. So obviously we're drawing a lot of the themes and the elements from the book into the movie. But the subtitle is The Tax Train is Coming. Why did we choose that subtitle? Well, as we've discussed in past episodes, one of my favorite analogies is a couple of years ago, I was watching The Roadrunner, and in that particular episode, the coyote was building a bomb with which to kill the Roadrunner. He was building that bomb within a shack, and he was so fixated on finishing the bomb that he didn't realize that the Roadrunner had pushed his shed onto a train track, and he was likewise so fixated on finishing the bomb that he didn't realize that there was a huge freight train bearing down on him. And I always ask my audience members, hey, if you were sitting on a train track with a huge freight train bearing down on you, what would you do? And they always say, well, I jump out of the way. Well, of course you jump out of the way. Well, going back to the coyote, did he jump out of the way? He did not jump out of the way. He simply pulled down the window shade, thinking that the act of doing so would make the problem go away. Problem didn't go away. And of course, coyote never really dies. It's frustrating, I know, but he emerged from the situation very much the worse for wear. And I make the case that for those of us who have accumulated the lion's share of our retirement in 401ks and IRAs, we have a huge freight train bearing down on us, and it's coming in the form of higher taxes. And we got a couple of choices of what we can do. We could pretend like the problem doesn't really exist. We could pretend like the math to which David Walker refers doesn't really add up, but that really is like pulling down the window shade. We're ignoring the math that says that tax rates will be forced up. So that is the primary motivation behind the title, The Tax Train is Coming. So you'll see there is a tax train theme that goes all throughout the movie. So we want to remind viewers that there is a tax train coming. We know in what form it's going to be here. We know roughly when it will when it will arrive, and we know exactly what we must do to get off the train tracks. So that's what drove the title. The other thing that really drove this movie was, David Walker made an Oscar-nominated movie back in, I believe it was 2009, called IOUSA. And he was running around the country with his hair on fire talking about the debt back then, which I believe was only about $10 trillion. So everybody was up in arms about the debt that was only $10 trillion. And here we are, nearly 10 years later, and the debt is now double. We're at 21 trillion. We're moving forward into a future where where the national debt will grow on average by $2 trillion per year. And nobody seems to be too worried about it. So I felt like it was time to reprise this issue of the national debt and what it means for you and me and what it means for the future of tax rates. So one of the questions one of the comments people make is that, wow, you have a lot of very important people in this movie. How did you get all of these experts to be in your movie? How did you get them to weigh in? And by the way, who do we have in our movie? We have some very important people that have some very important things to say about this issue. From academia, we've got Martin Eichenbaum. He's a dean over at Northwestern University. We've got Larry Kotlikoff. He's a PhD, one of the foremost experts on what we call the fiscal gap. The fiscal gap tells us what the true national debt is. In other words, what if we promise that we can't afford to deliver? The stated national debt is 21 trillion. The actual national debt, if you consider everything we've promised in terms of entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, it's actually 200 trillion. So we are understating to the American public our debt by a factor of 1,000%. So Larry Kotlikoff has a very compelling piece on the fiscal gap and what that means for our country. One of his partners in crime, Alan Arbach, out of Berkeley University, they've written a lot of articles together specifically about this subject. He weighs in very important stuff. He talks about why printing our way out of this pickle isn't going to work. And one of his points that he makes is that, hey, when Medicare, when you need Medicare in retirement, you go to your doctor and your doctor says, okay, it's $100 for a visit. Well, if we try to print our way out of our problems, we know that money is scarce or money is valuable because it's scarce. When you print more of it, it becomes less scarce. So eventually you could get to the point where a doctor's appointment costs $200. Well, if Medicare is paying for all of this, paying for your doctor bills, then printing money in essence just double the cost of all of these Medicare provided services. So printing money isn't going to do the trick. He does a very good job of making the case that that's not the way out. Nada Asa from Georgetown, she's a PhD associate professor. She talks about how tax rates over the next 10 years could double. Then we have people from various think tanks. We have George Shultz, who's former Secretary of State under Reagan. And a lot of people don't know this. Number one, that he's alive. He's 98 years old. Very, very spry and sprightly. The other thing that they don't know is that he is one of the brightest economic minds on the planet. And when we interviewed him, he says, the real issue that we're facing here, the thing that's going to squeeze everything out of the budget is Medicare. Medicare, and then the interest on the debt is going to squeeze everything out of the budget. So he says we're in a crisis. It's not 5 years from now. It's not 8 years from now. He says we're in a crisis right now. We got Maya McGinnis, Allison Winters from very important think tanks in Washington, D.C. They do a great job. Politicians, Tom McClintock, he's a congressman. He's on the Republican Budget Committee. He's out of California. He's actually the filmmaker Doug Orchard's congressman, and he was very gracious to meet with us. But this guy he doesn't pull any punches. He says in 8 years we'll be Venezuela, which is a sobering thought because we all know what's going on in Venezuela right now. And then we had a chance to interview the governor of Utah, Gary Herbert. His big point was we're in gridlock. And the analogy I like to use is to sort of expound on his point is that we're like, you got Democrats and Republicans sitting in the front seat of a car. Nobody wants to relinquish control of the steering wheel, and they're heading towards a fiscal cliff. And guess what? If nobody relinquishes the steering wheel, if nobody compromises and makes some really tough choices on how we're going to fix all these fiscal problems, guess what? The car goes over the cliff. And ask Russia what happens when your national fiscal car goes over a cliff. You cease to be a nation. And there's lots of nations in the history of the world who have taken the same course. It's not like we're forging into new territory here. We have industry experts. We have Ed Slott, who has filmed 6 PBS specials over the years. Tom Hegna is also PBS special. Don Blanton really has a great analogy on why 401ks and IRAs are like the government coming up to you and say, hey, look, I want to loan you some money. I'm not going to tell you, I don't need the money to be paid back right now. I'm not going to tell you what the interest rate is on the loan that I'm going to give you, but I will come back to you when I do need the money. Okay. Would you ever cash that check? And he says, not in a million years. Well, that the government is asking you to take that loan. And right now they have $21 trillion of debt. So we've got, we also have Van Miller speaks very eloquently on the demographic issues in our country, that those are only just beginning. Most of the baby boomers have yet to retire. A lot of times people think it's 11,000 people marching out of retirement onto the rolls of entitlement programs every year, but that's today. What happens moving forward is that goes up to 12,000, 13,000, 14,000, because the real heavy babies, the real heavy birth rates didn't happen until well into the 50s. And so we're starting to see the people from the late 50s, early 60s are approaching retirement. And as they do, we're going to see the cost of those programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, really start to skyrocket. And of course, we couldn't film the movie without interviewing David Walker, former Comptroller General of the federal government. Now, some people ask, Dave, how are you and Doug Orchard able to get all of these people in the movie? Well, it's not easy, for starters. You start off with an idea, and you start off with a movie, and you start off with a storyboard, but you have nobody that's agreed to be in your movie. And so we had a couple of harrowing weeks there where we didn't have anybody that was willing to be in our movie. Finally, I got a hold of David Walker. David Walker had helped edit the first chapter of my book, The Power of Zero, and even put a blurb on the back when I published it for the first time in 2014. And he was gracious enough to let us come to his house and interview him. And with some of the most compelling parts of the movie come from him. And once we had David Walker in the movie, we were able to use his name with, for example, Larry Kotlikoff. We were able to catch Larry Kotlikoff, and we're able to schedule a meeting with him. Once we got Larry Kotlikoff, we were able to get some other people. We were able to get Alan Arbach out of Berkeley. And then you start to build this resume of who's already in the movie. And before you know it, you're having George Shultz at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University saying, yes, I'll be in your movie. And once you get George Shultz, you can get just about anybody else. One of the people that a lot of people really liked in the movie was Armstrong Williams. He speaks very passionately and very emotionally about the issues and about how now is the time to start talking to our congressmen and representatives. Say, look, we don't want our country going over this fiscal cliff. We want you to be prudent with our country's purse strings. We want you to make wise decisions vis-a-vis our national debt. We don't want to live in a country where $53 trillion of debt means that all of the revenue coming into the U.S. Treasury at that point only goes to pay the interest on that debt. And there's nothing left in the pie to pay for important expenses. Like Social Security, Medicare for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to survive. So this is an important time in the history of our country for this, because we are really getting to the point where, as Tom McClintock says, we could approach what we call a sovereign debt crisis. Sovereign debt crisis can happen when you start to hit $1 trillion deficits. We are getting to the point by the end of this year, 2018, which is in a month, where we're going to be at fiscal deficits of $1 trillion, and that's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on. So this is David McKnight signing off. How can you get involved with this movie? If you are a financial advisor, you can go to thetaxtrain.com, and you can learn more about the movie. You can watch it for free. You can also order DVDs to distribute to your clients. If you are simply a baby boomer, you're not a financial advisor, this movie will be coming out in all sorts of different streaming formats come April. But if you want to watch the movie before then, talk to your financial advisor. Have your financial advisor go to thetaxtrain.com, where they can order DVDs to distribute to you. Anyway, thanks for being on this episode of the Power of Zero show, and we will talk to you next week.